pushed open the door of the Rowan house on a Tuesday morning, while Hester was still pulling on her boots, and he stood in the middle of her kitchen like he owned the floor beneath his feet, which, as of 6 o'clock that morning, he did. He had 2 men with him. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. One of them started pulling chairs away from the table. The other one opened the cupboard and began stacking Hester's dishes on the counter like he was taking inventory at a store. "You've got until noon," Creed said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the ceiling, at the window, at the cast iron pan hanging on the wall everywhere except her face. "Whatever you can carry, the rest stays." Hester stood very still. Her daughter Cora was still asleep in the back room. Her son Tobin had already gone to the well. She was 34 years old, and she had never in her life wanted to pick up a firearm as badly as she did in that moment. "My husband's debts," she said quietly, "are not my debts." Creed finally looked at her then. He smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, which was somehow worse. It was the smile of a man who had already won and knew it, and found the whole thing slightly boring. "The law disagrees," he said. "If you've ever stood in a room that used to be yours and watched someone else decide what you were allowed to take, then you already know what Hester Rowan felt that morning. And if you haven't, consider yourself lucky. This is her story, and I want you with me for all of it. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, the kind that doesn't flinch, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Like this video and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Hester. She had known something was wrong with Owen for months before he disappeared. There were signs she hadn't wanted to read. The way he stopped talking at dinner, the letters he'd start and never finish, the long rides he took alone, that he never explained when he came back. She had told herself it was grief. They'd lost a child the year before, a boy who didn't survive his first winter. And grief does strange things to men. She'd given Owen room because she thought he needed it. What he actually needed, it turned out, was to leave. He left on a Wednesday in early October, told her he was riding into Milford for feed, and never came back. No note, no message, nothing. 3 weeks later, a man named Grover Finch arrived at her door and introduced himself as Creed's property agent, and he explained, with the careful politeness of a man who has delivered bad news so many times, it stopped meaning anything, that Owen Rowan had borrowed $1,400 from Bramwell Creed against the value of the house and land, that the loan was 6 months past due, and that unless the full amount was paid within 30 days, the property would revert to Creed under the terms of the agreement. Hester had read the agreement. Owen had signed it. She didn't recognize the signature. It looked like his, but cramped and strange, like his hand had been shaking. But it was his name. The notary stamp was real. The paper was real. The debt was real. She spent 2 weeks trying everything she could think of. She wrote to Owen's brother in Kansas. No answer. She went to the county clerk and asked about her rights as a wife. The clerk was not unkind, but the news was not good. She asked Reverend Mott if there was anyone in town who might extend her credit or help her negotiate. There wasn't. She went to the bank in Milford and explained her situation, and the man behind the counter listened with his hands folded on his desk, and then explained that the bank didn't issue loans to women without a male co-signer. On the 28th day, she packed what she could carry, and she woke her children before sunrise. Tobin was 11. He didn't complain. He put on his coat and picked up the bundle she'd packed for him and asked which direction they were walking. Cora was 7. She cried a little, quietly, while Hester braided her hair, and then she stopped and didn't cry again. They left before Creed's men arrived. Hester didn't want her children to watch strangers go through their things. She'd heard about Calder Rusk, the way people hear about places they've never been in pieces, from different people, none of whom agreed on the details. Some said he was difficult. Some said he was just private. The woman at the dry goods store in Ferris Crossing told her he'd lost his wife 4 years back and hadn't been quite right since. A ranch hand she'd spoken to at the water trough said Rusk's operation was struggling, that he'd let 2 of his 3 hired men go in the spring and hadn't replaced them, and that the place showed it. What everybody agreed on was that he had land, more than he could work alone, and work that needed doing. Chester had sent a letter 3 weeks earlier before she'd fully accepted how bad things were, back when she still thought she might find another way. She'd written plainly. She was a woman with 2 children. She had experience keeping a household and a working property. She was willing to do whatever labor was needed in exchange for a place to stay while she got back on her feet. She hadn't made it sound desperate, though it was. She'd made it sound like an offer because that's what it was. She didn't know if Rusk had received the letter. She didn't know if he'd read it. She was walking to his ranch because she had nowhere else to go, and she decided that uncertainty was better than the alternative. The walk took most of 2 days. The first night they sheltered in a draw with a stand of cottonwoods that blocked the worst of the wind, and Hester built a small fire and made the children eat the last of the cornbread she'd wrapped in cloth. Tobin pretended he wasn't hungry so she would eat more, pretended not to notice. Cora fell asleep, leaning against her with one hand, still holding the edge of Hester's coat. Hester sat up for a long time after they were both asleep and watched the fire burn down and thought about nothing. Specifically, thinking about something specific was too dangerous. Specific thoughts led to questions she couldn't answer, and questions she couldn't answer led to the particular kind of fear that made your legs stop working. So she watched the coals and breathed and waited for morning. The second day was harder. Cora's shoes were rubbing a blister on her left heel, and she limped for the last few miles without saying anything about it. Hester only noticed when they stopped to rest, and she looked down and saw the way Cora was holding her foot. She took the shoe off and looked at the blister and said, "I should have noticed sooner." "Doesn't hurt that much," Cora said. "You don't have to say that," Cora shrugged. "I know." Tobin found a sturdy stick along the way and had been using it as a walking staff, and he offered it to Cora without making a big deal out of it, just held it out to her and kept walking. She took it. The 3 of them came over the last low ridge in the middle of the afternoon, and Hester got her first look at the Rusk Ranch spread out below them. Her first thought was, it's bigger than she'd imagined. Her second thought was, it needs more work than she'd hoped. The yard was cluttered with the evidence of things left, unfinished, a fence section that had started to lean and hadn't been corrected, a pile of lumber near the barn that had sat long enough the edges were starting to gray, tools hanging on the outside wall of a shed in a configuration that suggested they'd been grabbed in a hurry and not put back properly. The house itself was solid enough good construction, decent roof, but the porch railing had a broken post that someone had wrapped with rope as a temporary fix and then apparently forgotten about. She stood at the edge of the yard for a moment with one hand on Cora's shoulder and looked at all of it. She wasn't judging. She was reading. There was a difference. Calder Rusk came around the side of the barn before she'd decided whether to go to the door or call out. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way men get when they've been working alone and skipping meals. They didn't realize they were skipping. He had mud on his boots, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up despite the chill, and he stopped once he saw them like he'd been expecting someone, but not quite this. He looked at her. He looked at Tobin. He looked at Cora, who was leaning on Tobin's stick and looking back at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a 7-year-old who has recently stopped having anything to lose. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I apologize for the unannounced arrival. I didn't have a way to send word ahead." He looked at them a moment longer. Then he said, "You walked from Ferris Crossing?" "From further than that, actually." He didn't say anything to that. He looked past her at the empty ridge, like he was trying to calculate the distance, and didn't quite believe the number he came up with. "Well," he said finally, "come inside, I suppose." It wasn't warm the way he said it. It wasn't unwelcoming either. It was just a man acknowledging a fact. She could work with that. Inside of the house told her things the outside had started to. Not a dirty house. He was a man who made his bed and swept his floor, but a house where the effort had stopped at the surface. The curtains were clean, but the hem on one had come loose and been left. There was a small pile of correspondence on the table that had clearly been moved to make room for things, and then moved back. Kitchen was functional and grim, the kind of grim that settles in when there's nobody to cook for anyone but yourself. He made coffee. He put out bread and the remains of what looked like a pot of beans from earlier. He gestured at the bench, and she sat, and the children sat beside her, and nobody spoke for a minute. Then Tobin looked at the bread and looked at Rusk and said, "Thank you, sir." Rusk looked at him like he'd been startled by something small. "You're welcome," he said, and he sounded like the words were ones he hadn't used in a while. Hester let her children eat first. Rusk noticed. He didn't say anything, but she saw him notice. "My letter," she said. "Did you receive it?" "I did." "And your answer?" He sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at the table. "I don't need charity," he said, "and I can't afford to take on 3 people who aren't pulling weight." "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm offering labor. Real labor. I can cook, preserve, mend, manage a household budget, handle poultry, handle a kitchen garden. And I've done enough general ranch work to understand what needs doing, even if I haven't done all of it myself." Tobin is young, but he's not soft. She paused. "I'm offering work in exchange for a roof and food. What you'd normally pay a hired hand for half the tasks. You keep. I only want a place for my children." He looked at her then, with the expression of a man trying to figure out if he was being sold something. "Why here?" he said. "Why not somewhere in town? Because in town they'd want a husband or a reference, or a reason why I deserve consideration, and I don't have the patience for any of that right now. You have more work than you can do alone. I have more hours than I have options. That's a working arrangement, not a favor." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not close enough to call it that, but something that was adjacent to the idea of a smile. "Children sleep in the small room at the back," he said. "You take the loft. I'll clear out some of my things. I don't need you to clear anything on my account. Clear it anyway." That first night, after Cora and Tobin were asleep, Hester sat at the kitchen table alone, with the lamp turned low, and made a list of everything she'd seen wrong with the property. Not for Rusk's benefit yet, he hadn't asked, and she hadn't earned the right to offer. Just for herself. She needed to know what she was working with. The list was long. The barn door hung wrong, which meant it was fighting the prevailing wind every time it opened. The hay storage was in the wrong position relative to the drainage fall after a wet snow. Water would pool and work its way into the lower bales. Fence line to the north was adequate, but built without accounting for the way. Drifting snow would accumulate against it, which meant by February it would be buried and the cattle would walk over it. The ventilation in the barn was single direction, which in the cold months would trap moisture and make the animals work harder to stay warm. She wrote it all down. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She blew out the lamp and climbed to the loft and lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind had started to pick up. She could hear it moving around the corners of the house, testing the edges, looking for places to push through. She had been tested by worse things than wind. She wasn't afraid of it, but she listened to it a long time before she slept. Because she'd learned in the last 2 months that the things you ignored had a way of becoming the things that finished you. The ranch was a problem. It was a solvable problem. She believed that the way you believe something when you don't have room to believe the alternative. Closed her eyes. She'd start in the morning. Rusk was already up when she came down. He was at the stove barely, just standing near it with a cup in his hand, like the coffee was more comfort than caffeine. And he looked at her when she appeared at the foot of the loft ladder. "You're up early," he said. "I could say the same." He shrugged. "I don't sleep much." She moved him gently aside and took over the stove without making a production of it, and he stepped back without making a production of that either. He leaned against the wall and watched her crack 4 eggs into a pan like a man, watching a foreign country arrange itself in a way he couldn't quite predict. "I noticed your barn door," she said. "What about it?" "It's hung wrong. The angle fights the wind instead of using it." Shouldn't take more than an afternoon to rehang if you've got a spare hinge. Beat of silence. I have a spare hinge, he said. Good. She slid the eggs onto a plate and set it on the table and went back to put bread on to warm, and he came to the table slowly and sat down and looked at his breakfast like it had appeared by some process he wasn't entirely comfortable with. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it. I don't know. Someone with less to say, I think. Used to it, she said. Then, or you won't, and you'll tell me so, and I'll make other arrangements. I'm not here to make your life harder. I'm here because I need a place to stand while I figure out what comes next. Picked up his fork. Fair enough, he said. Outside, the wind pressed against the window glass, and the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard shook their arms against the pale morning sky. Somewhere in the small back room, Cora laughed at something, Tobin said, the sound of it muffled but clear, and Rusk's hand paused over his plate for just a second before he kept eating. Hester heard it too. She kept her face to the stove. She had not heard her daughter laugh in 3 weeks. The sound hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Not quite pain, not quite relief. Just a thing she hadn't realized she was waiting for. She kept her face to the stove and let the sound of it settle into the room, and she thought, this is the place. Whatever it costs, this is the place. She didn't know yet what it would cost. She had a feeling it was going to be considerable. But she'd stopped being afraid of considerable somewhere between the first night in the draw and the ridge above the ranch, and the moment she'd looked at Calder Rusk's rundown, fighting, barely hanging on property, and felt it, for the first time in months, something that almost felt like recognition. It was a mess. She understood messes. She knew how to start cleaning. The barn door was the first thing. Hester didn't ask permission. Asked Rusk where the spare hinges were, and he pointed at a wooden crate in the corner of the tool shed, and that was the end of the conversation. She pulled the door off herself with Tobin's help. The boy was stronger than he looked, wiry in the way of children, who've spent real time doing real work, and they laid it flat in the yard and spent an hour refitting the hinges at the angle she'd calculated. Rusk came out twice to watch. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask him to. But the second time he stood there longer, and when she drove the last screw home, and Tobin helped her lift the door back into place and it swung open with the wind instead of against it, she heard him make a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Smoother, he said finally. Yes, she said. She wiped her hands on her apron. The wind does most of the work if you let it. He looked at the door for another moment. Then he went back inside. Tobin looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything, but he was almost smiling, which was the most she'd seen from him in weeks. That was day 3. By the end of the first week, Hester had established the shape of the days in a way that left room for what needed doing, without making it feel like a military operation. She was up before Rusk, had coffee on when he came down, managed breakfast in a way that made it feel like an afterthought, even when it wasn't. The children ate with her before Rusk sat down, which meant his mornings stayed quiet the way she suspected he needed them. She wasn't trying to crowd him out of his own house. She was trying to read what kind of space he required and give it to him. Because a man who felt crowded in his own home was a man who would eventually ask her to leave it. What she was building, she understood, wasn't just a practical arrangement. It was a negotiation conducted mostly in silence and small actions. Cooked well. She kept the house. She didn't expect to be thanked, and she wasn't, not at first. And she didn't let that bother her the way it once might have. Owen had thanked her for everything excessively, performatively, in a way that had felt like love at first, and later felt like the behavior of a man who was always slightly guilty about something. She'd learned too late the difference. She didn't need Calder Rusk to be grateful. She needed him to trust that she was useful. Those were different things. The second week was when she started in on the hay storage problem. She'd been watching the drainage patterns after the rain they got on day 5. The water moved the way she'd expected off the slope to the east, pooling briefly against the base of the storage structure before finding its way through. But finding its way through slowly. slow enough that in a heavy snowmelt situation, or a rain that lasted more than a day, it would back up, and backed up water against the base of hay storage, in temperatures that dropped and rose and dropped again, was the beginning of the end of your winter feed. She brought it up at dinner on the 12th night. She'd learned by then that the best time to say something to Calder Rusk was not when he was in the middles of something, and not when he'd just come in tired, and not right at the start of a meal, when hunger makes everyone slow. It was after he'd eaten most of a plate, and his shoulders had come down from where he wore them, when he was working through something in his head. She'd been watching for that. She'd noticed it happen reliably about 2/3 of the way through supper. She put the problem plainly. The drainage fall was wrong. The base of the structure needed to be raised 3 to 4 inches on the eastern side, and if she had the right lumber and a couple of days, she could fix it before the real cold came. Rusk put his fork down. "Who told you about the drainage?" he said. "Nobody. I watched the rain." He looked at her in the way he was starting to look at her when she said things like this, not suspicious exactly, but not entirely comfortable either. Like a man who'd lived alone long enough that having someone else correctly name a problem in his own operation felt like a minor invasion. "I know it's there," he said. "I was going to get to it." "I know," she said. "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying I can handle it if you'll let me, and if you've got the lumber." "I've got the lumber. Then I'd like to try." He picked his fork back up and ate for a moment. "You've done drainage work before?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." "No," she said, "not drainage specifically. But I understand how water moves. My father had a mill water that moves wrong. Costs you everything eventually. You stop it early or you pay for it late." He chewed. He looked at the table. He was a man who made decisions slowly and lived with them fully, and she was starting to understand that the silence between her suggestion and his answer wasn't reluctance. It was just the way his mind worked. "Don't start until I have time to look at what you're planning," he said. "I'm not arguing against it. I want to see the plan." "Fair enough." She showed him the next morning. She drew it out on the back of a flour sack, the slope angles, the proposed elevation on the eastern edge, the way the water would redirect. It wasn't a formal drawing, but it was precise, because she'd spent the better part of an evening working out the numbers. He looked at it for a long time. He pointed at 2 spots and asked questions. She answered both. He pointed at a 3rd spot and started to ask something, then stopped and looked at it again. He said. "What? That's going to work," he said. It sounded slightly grudging. She didn't think he meant it that way. It sounded more like a man recalibrating something. "I think so," she said. "All right," he said. "But if you're wrong, if I'm wrong, I'll fix it myself. That's the deal I'm offering." He folded the flour sack drawing and handed it back. "Start Monday," he said. "Tobin can help you." The ranchers started showing up at the end of the 3rd week. Not to welcome her. That would have required them to recognize that she was someone worth welcoming, which most of them weren't prepared to do. They came with the usual excuses, borrowed tools, questions about cattle, the kind of neighborly check-ins that weren't really about neighboring at all. Came to look. The first was a man named Garrett Hollis, who ran cattle on the land to the south and wore his hat like it was a crown. He showed up while Hester was resetting the base structure on the hay storage with Tobin, and he stood at the yard's edge and watched them for a while without announcing himself, which told her everything she needed to know about him. When Russ came out of the barn, Hollis tilted his chin toward Hester and said, "That your new hand?" "That's Mrs. Rowan," Rusk said. "She's helping me get the place sorted." Hollis looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has already decided something is funny before he's figured out exactly why. "What's she doing to your feed structure?" "Fixing a drainage problem." He watched her work. "She a carpenter now?" Rusk said. "She's useful." It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was a fact stated in the way you state facts when you don't have patience for the conversation you're already in, and Hollis heard it that way and changed the subject. But he looked at Hester twice more before he left, and both times it was the look of a man who's filed something away. Tobin waited until he was gone. I don't like him, he said quietly. You don't have to like him, Hester said. Hand me that level. The second visitor was worse. Bramwell Creed came on a Thursday afternoon with no men this time, just himself on a good horse, and he tied up at the post and walked to where Hester was working in the yard with the slow confidence of a man who's never had to hurry for anything. She heard his boots. She recognized the rhythm of them, the same rhythm as the morning in her kitchen, and she kept her hands on the work and didn't turn around. Mrs. Rowan, he said. She turned then, because ignoring him was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. Mr. Creed. He looked at the modified hay structure. He looked at the new barn door, which was standing open in the breeze, moving easy. He looked at the fence repair Tobin had done near the north gate, which was solid in a way the original hadn't been. Settling in, he said. Working, she said. He smiled. Same smile as before. Slightly bored. Slightly amused. You know Rusk's operation has been going downhill for 3 years. Has it? I offered to buy this land twice. Fair price both times. He wouldn't take it. He tilted his head. Man's stubborn. Sounds like he knows what his land is worth. Something flickered behind Creed's eyes that wasn't quite warmth. You think fixing a hay structure and rehanging a barn door turns a ranch around, Mrs. Rowan? I think ignoring small problems until they become big ones is how ranches fail, she said. But I suppose you'd know better than me. He looked at her for a long moment. She held it. She'd had a lot of practice in the last month at holding things she couldn't afford to drop. You're a long way from where you started, he said, and you're still standing in someone else's yard. For now, she said. He laughed at that, a real laugh, short and surprised, and went back to his horse and rode out. Rusk appeared from the barn 10 seconds later, which meant he'd heard most of it. He didn't say anything at first. He came to stand beside her and looked at the road where Creed had gone. He's going to be a problem, he said. He already was one, Hester said. He doesn't frighten me. He should. I know. She picked up her hammer. He does. I just don't let him see that. Plan she built in those early weeks was not one plan. It was 4 plans overlapping, each one solving a piece of the whole. The hay storage drainage was the first piece. The second was the ventilation in the barn, a second airflow opening on the north wall, angled to draw the damp air out without pulling in the worst of the wind. She spent a week on this, cutting the opening herself with a handsaw, which was slow and hard and left her right arm aching for 3 days. But she did it because Rusk had enough to do without adding her projects to his list. The third piece was the fence line. She walked the north boundary twice, then came back and told Rusk exactly which sections needed adjusting and why, describing the way the drifting snow would behave against each angle. He listened. He didn't argue. He came with her the third time, and she showed him what she was seeing, and after that, he started making some of the adjustments himself. The fourth piece, the wind barrier, was where things got complicated. She'd been thinking about it since the first night she lay, in the loft, listening to the wind test the corners of the house. The ranch sat in a way that left the northeast side exposed in a particular configuration, not the worst possible, but bad enough that in a serious blizzard, the drifting pattern would push directly against the cattle pen and the hay storage, which meant any storm strong enough to matter would hit both the animals and their feed at the same time. The traditional solution was to build a straight barrier, a solid fence line, running roughly perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction. That's what every other rancher in the area had done. The problem with a straight barrier was that it stopped the wind but couldn't redirect the snow. The drift would pile up directly against it and eventually over it. In a real blizzard, a straight barrier became part of the problem. What she was proposing was an angled barrier, not perpendicular to the wind, but set at approximately 30 degrees from perpendicular in a configuration that would deflect the snow to the left and let it pile in the open ground north of the pen rather than against the structure. It was a small difference on paper. In practice, in a genuine blizzard, it was the difference between a drift that buried your fence and a drift that went somewhere you'd planned for it to go. Drew it out. She showed Rusk. She explained the angles and the reasoning. He looked at it for a long time. That's not how it's done, he said. I know. You've seen this work somewhere? I've seen straight barriers fail, she said. The reasoning on the angle is sound. The wind has to go somewhere. You're just choosing where. He rubbed the side of his jaw. He had a habit of doing that when something was costing him more consideration than he'd expected to give it. What if you're wrong? Then we lose the labor of building it and we put up a straight one instead. It's not a permanent mistake. It's a theory we can test. Theories are expensive out here. So are straight barriers that don't work. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he said, "What if we do one section? Small, see what happens in the first storm." He had not expected that. She'd expected a flat no or a prolonged argument. The offer of a small test section that was a man who was actually thinking about it rather than dismissing it. "One section," she said. "If it performs the way I expect, we expand. If it doesn't, I take it down myself and you say I told you so." He looked at her. "I wouldn't say that. Most people would." "I'm not most people," he said, and went back to the barn. The reaction from the neighboring ranchers when they saw what she was building was more or less what she'd expected, which didn't make it easier to absorb. Hollis came by again while the first section was going up and stood at the fence, watching with his arms crossed and his hat tilted back and a look on his face that a more charitable person might have called concern. "That's not going to work," he said to Rusk, who was nearby. "Maybe not," Rusk said. "The angle's wrong. Wind comes straight. Barrier should go straight. That's how everyone does it, I know. So why are you letting her?" Hollis paused, recalibrated. "I mean, she clearly doesn't know the country." "She knows some things," Rusk said. Hollis looked at Hester, who was working with Tobin to set a post and had been listening to every word without acknowledging any of it. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. She looked up. "I've ranched this land for 11 years, he said. "The wind out here doesn't behave the way you think it does." "Tell me how you think I think it behaves," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. He hadn't expected to be asked a question. "I'm serious," she said. "Tell me what you think I've gotten wrong. Maybe you've seen something I haven't." It was not sarcasm. She meant it. She was not too proud to be corrected by a man who'd worked this land for 11 years. But she'd found that actually asking the question sincerely, plainly, without armor had a way of separating the men who had real information from the men who had only objections. Hollis had only objections. He said something vague about the prevailing direction and the way drifts piled, none of it specific enough to be useful. She listened. She nodded where he had a point. She said she'd keep it in mind. He left looking slightly wrong-footed in a way she suspected he didn't fully understand. Creed was the one who made it public. He came to the Milford trading post on the same Thursday. She and Rusk went in for supplies, and he made a point of gathering an audience, the way men like Creed always do. Not loudly, just by placing himself where people could hear. And he described Hester's wind barrier project in a tone of affectionate ridicule that was designed to be repeated. "Rusk's got himself a woman engineer," he said, "building a fence at an angle. Says the wind will follow directions." He smiled at the men around him. "Can't wait to see the results." She heard it. She was 2 aisles over, with a list in her hand, and she heard every word. She added 3 things to her list that she hadn't come in planning to buy: extra nails, an additional length of rope, and a small notebook she'd use to document the wind patterns over the coming weeks. Evidence she could point to later. She didn't respond to Creed. Not then. She went to the counter and paid for her things and went outside to the wagon, and she sat on the seat and waited for Rusk to finish his business. And she looked at the main street of Milford and breathed the cold air and thought about failure, because that was the real weight of it, not Creed's mockery, not Hollis's doubt. The real weight was the fact that she could be wrong. She'd been wrong before about things she'd been sure of. She had staked her credibility, the small, fragile, newly constructed credibility that was the only thing standing between her family and another winter in the cold, on an idea about how wind and snow and angle interacted, in conditions she'd never actually experienced firsthand. She believed she was right, but belief wasn't certainty. Russ climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. He'd heard Creed. He looked at her sideways. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She wasn't entirely, but yes was what the moment needed. He nodded. "Creed's been trying to get my land for 3 years," he said. "He wants to watch me fail. It's got nothing to do with your fence. I know that. I'm saying," he paused, started again. I'm saying his opinion doesn't carry weight with me. Just in case you were wondering." She looked at him. It was perhaps the longest unsolicited statement he'd made to her since she'd arrived. "Thank you," she said. He made the sound he made when a response was called for, but he didn't have one, a low, short exhale, not quite a grunt, and clicked at the horse, and they went home. The nights were getting colder. Real cold now, not the edge of autumn chill of the first weeks, but the deep settling cold that meant winter. Wasn't coming so much as it had already arrived and was making itself at home. Hester could feel it in the mornings. When she climbed down from the loft, the floorboards held the chill like a stone, holds a bruise, slow and stubborn. She'd added to her routine by then. After the children were asleep, she spent an hour, most nights, writing down observations. What the wind had done that day, where the temperature had dropped fastest, how the animals had behaved, what the sky looked like to the northwest. She'd learned from her father that you don't understand a thing by looking at it once. You understand it by watching it behave over time. Rusk found her at the table one night past 10, still writing. He'd come down for water and stopped when he saw the lamp still burning. "Don't sleep," he said. "I sleep enough." He looked at the notebook. "What is that?" "Wind records. Temperature observations. I'm building a picture of what this particular piece of land does in the weeks before a hard storm." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She looked up at him. He was leaning in the doorway in his socks, which somehow made him look less formidable and more like an actual human being than she'd seen him look yet. "Because the barrier I built is a theory," she said, "and I want enough information that if it works, I can tell you why, and if it fails, I can tell you that too, and not just guess." He looked at her in that particular way he had, like she'd said something that required him to revise a conclusion he'd already drawn. "Most people don't do that," he said. "Keep records? Prepare for being wrong." She set her pen down. "Being wrong is survivable," she said. "Being wrong and not knowing why, that's what finishes you." He looked at the notebook for another moment. Then he went and got his water and went back upstairs. But in the morning there was a second cup of coffee waiting on the stove. When she came down, poured and sitting there, still hot. He'd been up before her. He'd poured 2 cups. That was all it was. She didn't make more of it than that, but she drank it. The first real test came not from a storm, but from Tobin. He'd been working hard, and without complaint, since the day they arrived, harder than any 11-year-old should be expected to work. Harder than she sometimes let herself acknowledge, because acknowledging it felt like its own kind of failure. He repaired fence sections, helped with the livestock feeding, carried and hauled, and did what was asked of him, and what wasn't asked, but obviously needed doing. He had her father's eye for systems. He could look at something broken and see not just the break, but the piece that had allowed the break to happen. But he was 11. And one afternoon in the middle of November, she found him sitting on the ground behind the barn, with his back against the boards, and his arms on his knees, not doing anything, just sitting. She sat down beside him. He didn't look at her. "I miss him," said. She didn't ask who. "I know," she said, even though he left. "Yes." Tobin picked at a piece of dried mud on his boot. "Do you think he's dead?" She considered lying. She'd been considering it since October, running the calculation, every few days would a lie be kindness or cowardice, and she'd never fully decided. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think so. I think he ran. Because of the money." "Yes." "Why didn't he tell us?" She didn't have an answer for that. She had theories: shame, fear, the particular paralysis of a man who'd made bad decisions and couldn't face the people he'd made them in front of. But those were adult explanations, and Tobin was sitting in the mud behind a stranger's barn, asking a question that deserved better than an adult explanation. "I don't know," she said again. He was quiet for a while. "I don't want to be like him," he said. "You're not," she said immediately, and then caught herself. "I mean, you don't have to be. Who you are is something you build. It's not just who your father was." He looked at her sideways. "Mr. Rusk said something like that." She blinked. "Did he?" He said, "When I was fixing the North Gate section, he was watching, and he said men who run from problems don't build anything that lasts." Tobin shrugged one shoulder. "I think he was trying to be helpful." "I think so too." She put her hand on the back of his neck briefly the way she'd done when he was smaller. The gesture she wasn't sure anymore he'd want, and he didn't pull away. They sat there for another few minutes in the cold, not talking, and then he got up and went back to work, and so did she. That evening she watched Rusk show Tobin how to properly tension a wire fence section, standing behind him and adjusting his grip on the tool without making a fuss of it, just showing him the right way. Tobin paid attention the way he always did, completely efficiently, storing it away. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the two of them, and felt something she wasn't sure she had a right to feel yet. The wind came in from the northwest that night, harder than it had been, and the angled section of the barrier made a sound she hadn't expected, a low, humming resistance against the gust, not breaking, just holding. She lay in the loft and listened to it. It sounded like something that was going to be tested soon. Really tested, not the preliminary nudges of early winter, but the full weight of a season that had no interest in anything's survival. She'd done what she could do. She'd built what she could build with what she had. Now came the part she couldn't control, whether it was enough. Cold came down hard the first week of December, the kind of cold that had a weight to it, that you could feel pressing on the roof of the house and sitting in the corners of rooms where the fire didn't quite reach. Hester had been watching the sky for 10 days. By then, the particular gray of it, the way the clouds moved from the northwest in a formation that her father had called stacked trouble, and she'd been pushing the preparation work faster because of it. The hay storage modification was finished. The drainage correction had held through 2 medium rains and a light snow, and the water had moved the way she'd drawn it on the flour sack off to the east, away from the base, leaving the structure dry. Rusk had checked it after the second rain and come back in without saying anything, but that evening at dinner, he'd given her a slightly larger portion of the stew, which she'd understood as the equivalent of a speech. The angled wind barrier, the full version now, not just the test section, was 70% complete. They'd expanded it after the first section held through 3 windstorms without the drift pattern she'd predicted materializing on the wrong side. And Rusk had brought it up himself one morning, said they should probably do the rest before the serious weather arrived. She'd agreed without making a big deal of it, which was the right call because making a big deal of it would have made him uncomfortable and he'd have found a way to add a condition to the agreement. It was 70% complete, and she was pushing to finish it. That was the context for the mistake. She should have caught it sooner. That was the truth she had to sit with, the one that didn't get easier the more she turned it over. She'd built the drainage system to move water away from the base of the hay storage, and she'd gotten that right. What she hadn't fully accounted for, what she'd known in theory, but pushed slightly aside in the rush of all the other work, was the airflow question. The new drainage configuration was tighter against the eastern wall than the original. Not critically so, but enough. And when she'd checked in the ventilation situation in the barn, she'd been so focused on the livestock that she hadn't applied the same thinking to the feed storage. The hay storage needed to breathe. She knew that. She'd known it from the beginning. But in the last 10 days of accelerated preparation, she'd sealed the eastern access panel too thoroughly, packed it too tight with the insulating material she'd added against the cold, and what she'd created, without quite realizing it, was a box that kept the warmth in and the moisture in equally. Tobin found it. He'd gone in for an armload of feed on a Thursday morning and came back into the kitchen with a look on his face. that she recognized the careful, measured expression he wore when he had information he knew she needed but wasn't sure how to deliver. "Ma," he said, "there's something wrong with the hay." She was at the stove. She turned around. "Which end?" she said. "East corner. Bottom 2 rows. It feels damp." She was outside in under a minute, and Rusk was coming from the barn at the same time, drawn by whatever instinct a man develops after years of watching a property he can't afford to lose. She pulled the access panel herself. The smell came out before her eyes fully adjusted to the dimness, not rot, not yet, but the green damp smell of moisture that had been trapped and warming rather than releasing. She pressed her palm against 3 bales. 2 were damp. The third was worse than damp. She stayed crouched there for a moment with her hand on the 3rd bale. Behind her, Rusk said nothing. She could feel him looking. She stood up and turned around. She didn't give herself time to soften it. "I sealed the eastern panel too tight," she said. "The moisture from the temperature changes had nowhere to go. I've got wet bales in the east corner, maybe 12, maybe more. I have to open it up and check everyone." Rusk's face was very still. "How many?" he said. "I don't know yet. I have to check everyone." "Hester, I know," she said. "It was my mistake. I'm not going to argue that." He looked at her, and then at the storage, and then at the sky, which was doing what the sky had been doing. For the better part of the week, building, slowly and without hurry, towards something significant. "How long to fix it?" he said. "If I start now and Tobin helps, we can have the panel configuration corrected and the affected bales isolated and restacked by end of tomorrow. The dry ones stay dry as long as we reopen the airflow tonight. The wet ones, some are borderline. Some are past borderline. Those I don't know yet." He pressed his lips together. He was calculating. She could see him calculating. The winter ahead, the cattle head count, how much feed the operation needed to carry through to March, and she let him do it without speaking because this was his land and his animals and his calculation to make. And she'd already cost him enough by not catching this earlier. "Do what you need to do," he said finally. "I'll handle the morning feeding. I'll pay back the loss." "Stop," he said, not unkindly, just firmly. "Just fix it." She fixed it. She spent the rest of that day on her knees in the storage structure, pulling bales, checking, sorting. Tobin worked beside her without being asked twice. Cora, who was small enough to fit into the narrower sections, helped shift the dry bales that were hard to reach from the main aisle. By mid-afternoon, her arms were shaking, and her back was giving her opinions she didn't want to hear. And Tobin had a cut on his forearm from a wire she hadn't noticed in time, and Cora had hay in her hair, and a look of intense 7-year-old seriousness that Hester would have found funny under different circumstances. They found 16 compromised bales. Of those, 7 were salvageable if they were spread out and dried properly, and used first when feeding came. 9 were a write-off green enough through the middle that they'd make the cattle sick. 9 bales. Not the end of the operation. Not nearly. Not nothing. Rusk didn't say anything when she reported the final count that evening. He was sitting at the table with his coffee and his hands around the cup, and he listened to her numbers without expression. And then he said, "I'll adjust the supplemental feeding schedule. Stretch the good stock. I want to go over the rest of the modifications with you," she said. "All of them. I want you to tell me what I've missed." He looked at her then. "You haven't missed anything else," he said. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching what you're doing. I'm not," he paused, started over. "I'm not just a man standing in his own yard while a stranger rearranges things. I've been watching every step. The drainage is good. The barn ventilation is good. The barrier is good. He stopped. This was one mistake. One panel sealed too tight. That's the only thing I've seen that was wrong." She looked at him. The lamp between them put shadows in his face and made him look older than he was, or maybe just more honest. "You're not saying that to make me feel better," she said. "I'm not in the habit," he said. She breathed out slowly. 9 bales, she said. "Could have been the whole storage," he said. Tobin hadn't caught it today. He looked at his cup. "You built the thing that almost failed. But you also built the son, who knew what to look for. She was quiet for a moment. It was perhaps the most he'd said at one time about either of her children, and it landed differently than she expected, not like a compliment, more like an observation from someone who'd been paying closer attention than he'd let on. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up again and was moving against the house in a long, continuous pressure, not gusting but pushing, steady and cold and purposeful. "Storm's coming," he said. "I know. Not a regular one." She'd been thinking the same thing for 3 days. The sky had told her, and the wind had told her, and the animals had told her the way the cattle had been pressing closer to the structure. In the evenings, the way the horses had been restless. "How bad do you think?" she said. He shook his head slowly. "Can't know for sure. But the ones who've been out here as long as me, you learn to tell when the land is getting serious." "Serious?" He looked at the window. "Yeah," he said. "Serious." She finished the airflow correction the next morning and spent the afternoon doing a final check on the barrier. She walked the full length of it, testing each post, checking each horizontal run, looking at the angle again from a distance to make sure it was what she'd intended. Tobin walked with her and didn't talk much, and she was grateful for that. Some things you needed company for, and some things you needed silence for, and this was silence. At the far end of the barrier, she stopped and looked north. The sky in that direction had a color she'd been watching deepen for a week, a pale, almost white gray that had nothing soft about it, the gray of something with intention. "We need the gates checked," she said. "The hinges on the south cattle pen, especially, they've been stiff since last week." "I'll do it tomorrow morning," Tobin said. "Do it today," she said. He looked at the sky. He saw what she saw. "Today," he said, and went without needing more. Rusk spent that evening doing what ranchers do before serious weather. He checked the feed he had against the number of animals he had and calculated the gap. He checked the roof of the barn for the section he'd been meaning to repair and decided there wasn't time and did what he could with what was there. He brought the 4 most vulnerable calves into the small interior pen near the barn wall, the one that would stay warmest. Hester watched him do all of this with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd survived frontier winters before and knew that the time for doubting your preparation was before the storm, not during. She was carrying her own version of the same calculation. The wind barrier angle, she'd been over it 20 times in her head. The drainage checked. The ventilation reconfigured, and she was confident about it now. Fully confident. The way you only get to confident after you've made a mistake and corrected it and checked the correction. The fence line modifications. Tobin's gate hinges. She couldn't think of what she'd missed. That didn't mean she hadn't missed anything. Just meant she couldn't see it yet. That night she wrote in her notebook for the last time before the weather hit. She wrote the wind direction, the temperature at sundown, the sky reading, and then she put the pen down and sat with her hands flat on the table. She'd done the work now. The land was going to respond to the work, and either the work was sufficient or it wasn't. She closed the notebook and went up to the loft. Storm arrived the next afternoon. Not at night the way storms did in stories, not in the dramatic darkness, with everything already asleep and helpless. It arrived in the middle of the afternoon, while they could still see it coming, while there was still daylight enough to matter, and just enough time to make a decision or two that hadn't been made yet. Hester was in the barn checking the calves when the light changed. She looked up and saw it through the open barn door, a wall of white moving across the flat ground from the northwest, moving faster than she'd expected, faster than the sky had suggested it would. Kind of fast, that meant the weather had made up its mind about something. "Close the door," she said to Tobin, who was 3 feet away. He was already moving. The wind hit the barn like something thrown. The whole structure flexed. She felt it in the boards under her feet and then steadied, because it was a well-built barn, and it had been built with a sense of what this land could do. But the sound of it was something she hadn't anticipated, the full-throated roar of wind that had been building for days and had finally found its target. She went to the barn door and opened it 6 inches and looked out. The barrier was doing what it was supposed to do. You could see it in the way the snow was moving. It hit the angled barrier and deflected, curling to the left, away from the cattle pen, building up in the open ground to the north, where she'd planned for it to go. Not perfectly. There was some accumulation on the near side of the barrier, too, more than she'd wanted, but far less than there would have been with a straight barrier or no barrier at all. That was the good news. There was also bad news. The fence on the southeast side, the section that Hollis had told her, was fine, that Rusk had assessed as adequate, that she had looked at twice and decided not to touch because she'd had too many other priorities, was in trouble. The wind had found an angle she hadn't mapped, coming slightly from the east of where the prevailing direction suggested, and it was driving snow directly against a 40-foot section of that fence in a way that was going to bury it inside 2 hours. If it buried it, the cattle had an exit. Cattle in a blizzard with an open fence line meant cattle scattered and lost, and cattle scattered and lost in this kind of weather didn't come back. Close the barn door. Stay with the calves, she told Tobin. Keep them on the warm side. Don't open the door for any reason until I come back, or Mr. Rusk comes back. What are you doing? Tobin said. Fixing something, she said, and went out. The wind hit her like a physical object. She had her coat and her scarf and her gloves, and none of it was adequate, but none of it was supposed to be adequate for this. You didn't dress for this kind of storm to be comfortable. You dressed for it, to stay alive long enough to do what needed doing. She found Rusk in the yard, already moving toward the barn, and she caught his arm and had shout to be heard over the wind. She told him about the southeast fence, the angle, the drift building, the timeline. We can reinforce it, he shouted back. I've got stakes. There's no time to reinforce 40 feet of fence in this wind, she said. We need to redirect the approach. What? The snow is coming from the east-southeast. If we break a section of the fence 20 feet north of where the drift is building, we change the wind's path. It gives the snow somewhere to go that isn't against the line. Stared at her. Snow was hitting his face, and he was squinting against it, and she could see him processing what she'd said. We'd be breaking our own fence, he said, yes. In a blizzard, yes. If it doesn't work, we've got a section of broken fence instead of a buried section of fence. The result is the same, but we've got a gap in a location we chose instead of a location the storm chose. She was gripping his arm, called her. We have maybe 30 minutes before that drift is over the top of that line. He looked at the fence. He looked at the storm. He looked at her. Where exactly, he said. She told him they went. The work was brutal. The wind didn't care about deadlines or calculations, or the difference between a good idea and a bad one. It just pushed, constantly, with the mindless insistence of something that had no concept of anyone's survival. Hester's hands stopped feeling like her hands about 10 minutes in. She could see them and tell them what to do, but the sensation was gone, replaced with a thick, muffled pressure that she trusted and kept moving. They got 4 fence posts out. She'd wanted 6, to be certain, but 4 was what the storm allowed. The gap opened up a 23-foot section in the location she'd calculated, and she watched the wind hit it and do what wind does. It found the path of least resistance, which was now the gap, and it pulled the snow through and deposited it on the far side in a drift that was building in open ground instead of against the buried line. It was working. Not perfectly. Nothing about it was perfect, but it was working. That was when she heard Rusk's go down. She didn't see it. She was facing the fence, watching the drift pattern, but she heard it, a short, hard sound against the frozen ground, and she turned, and he was on one knee with his right hand pressed against his left arm. She was beside him in 6 steps. What happened? Post came loose, he said through his teeth. Hit me on the way down. Think it caught the shoulder. Can you move your fingers? He moved them. They both looked at, that his fingers moving against the dark of his coat, and it meant something neither of them said out loud. Not broken, he said. No, but you can't work with it tonight. She looked at the gap they'd made. It was doing what she needed it to do. She looked at the cattle pen. The animals were pressed together, but contained. The barrier on the northeast side, showing snow piling up exactly where she'd planned. She looked at Rusk. Can you walk? I can walk. Go inside. I'll check the cattle line and then get Tobin. I'm not going inside while my called her. She said it quietly enough that the wind almost took it. He looked at her. You've got one working arm in a blizzard. You're not helping by staying out here. You're a liability, and you know it. He looked at her for a long second. She could see the argument forming and dissolving, the practical man in him, overriding the stubborn one. I'll get the boy, he said. He's in the barn. Tell him I need him at the southeast line and tell him to bring the spare wire from the shelf near the door. He went. She turned back to the storm. She checked the cattle pen. The barrier was holding. The drift was building where she'd wanted it. The animals were stressed, but not breaking. She checked the buried section. They'd been worried. About the gap had changed the wind's approach enough that the buildup there had slowed, still accumulating, but no longer at the pace that would have topped the line. She checked the barn, solid, holding. The reinforced door. Rusk had braced before the storm came in, not moving. Tobin appeared through the white, like a shape, assembled from weather, hunched against the wind, with the wire over his shoulder. He looked at her. She pointed at the gap section. We're going to string a temporary line across the gap, she said. Not to stop the wind we want the wind through, just to keep the cattle on the right side. 2 strands, shoulder height for a cow. Can you do that? He looked at the gap. He looked at the wire. He was 11 years old and standing in the middle of a blizzard, and she could see him calculating the same way she'd been calculating. The same machinery behind different eyes. Yeah, he said, I can do that. He did it. He wasn't fast, but he was precise, which was what the job needed, and he didn't ask her to help once he understood what was required. She watched him work for 30 seconds and then turned her attention back to the drift patterns, tracking, adjusting her read of the storm as more information came in. The wind barrier was performing at roughly 85% of what she'd hoped. The southeast fence gap was performing at roughly 70%, better than nothing, not as good as ideal. The barn was solid. The calves were safe. The main cattle herd was contained and stressed but contained. She stood in the middle of all of it in the howling white and took stock. This was the real accounting, not the numbers on paper, not the drawings on flour sacks, not the theory. The ranch was going to make it through this storm. She didn't let herself celebrate that thought. It wasn't over. The storm would run for hours yet, maybe through the night, maybe longer, and the decision she'd made in the last 30 minutes could still unravel if she'd miscalculated the drift on the east side, or if the temporary wire Tobin had strung wasn't heavy enough, or if the shoulder injury meant Rusk couldn't work for days and the feeding schedule fell behind. There were 20 ways this could still go wrong. She knew all 20 of them. She checked the southeast line one more time, confirmed Tobin's wire was holding, made a note of 2 places where it would need reinforcement when the storm eased, and then went to find her son. He was standing back from the gap section, looking at his work with the wire. His face was red from the cold, and his hat had been pushed sideways, and he'd made no effort to fix it. Put her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her. Is it good? He said. He meant the wire. It's good, she said. He nodded. He wasn't going to ask if the whole thing was going to be okay. He was too old for that now, or he'd aged past the point where questions like that served any purpose, and she wasn't sure she was glad about that or not. Come inside, she said. We'll check every hour until it eases. They walked back to the house through the white, and the storm roared around them without caring what it destroyed, the way storms never do, the way the world never does. It just does what it does. The only question is what you've built against it. Rusk was at the table when they came in, his coat off, his left arm held careful against his side. Cora was next to him with a bowl of warm water and a cloth, cleaning a cut on his forearm that was more dramatic looking than serious. She was doing it with great seriousness, her tongue slightly between her teeth, pressing gently the way Hester had shown her. Rusk looked at the level of care being administered to him, and then looked slightly sideways like a man who wasn't sure how to exist inside this much attention. Hester hung up her coat and stood near the stove to warm her hands and watched Cora work without interfering. "How bad?" she said, meaning the shoulder. "Bruised," he said. "Not broken. I can work tomorrow if the storm's eased." "We'll see, I can work tomorrow," he repeated. She let it go. Cora finished cleaning the cut and sat back and examined her work. "You should put something on it," she told Rusk. "There's iodine in the—" "I know where it is," Cora said, and went to get it. Rusk watched her go and then looked at Hester with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before. It was somewhere between bewilderment and something else, something she couldn't name exactly. "She's been out here an hour," he said. "She did all of this herself. She's been watching me tend things since she could walk," Hester said. "She knows what to do." He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't ask if you were okay," he said. "She knew you were okay. She came directly to me because she decided I was the one who needed help." Hester turned to the stove. She poured what was left of the coffee into a cup and set it in front of him without looking at his face again, because something was happening in her chest that she didn't want visible. "Drink that," she said. "You're cold." Outside, the storm did what it was doing. The walls held. The barrier held. The wire Tobin had strung across the gap held through the worst of the first night, and when it finally started to slip at 3 in the morning, Tobin was already awake and out the door in the time it took Hester to get her boots on. And by the time she reached him, he'd fixed it and was standing in the lessening wind with his hands on his hips, looking at the drift pattern with an expression that was entirely his own part. Her part, something that was just him, particular individual he was turning out to be. The storm eased by morning. Not gone, nothing about it was gone, but eased. The pressure dropped out of the wind, and what remained was cold and quiet in the aftermath way, the world white and still and unfamiliar. Hester stood in the doorway of the house and looked at it. The angled barrier had built a drift to the north exactly where she'd intended, a clean, deep wedge of snow piling in the open ground. Cattle pen was accessible. The barn was standing. The southeast line, the gap she'd made, the wire Tobin had strung, was intact. She stood there for a long time. She'd been right. She'd been wrong about the panel. She'd been right about almost everything else. Storm had tested the difference between the two things, and the difference had mattered. She didn't feel vindicated. That would have been the wrong response, and she knew it. She felt tired and cold and grateful in a way she wasn't ready to examine, yet not gratitude to anyone or anything in particular, just the raw, plain, animal gratitude of having come through something with everyone still alive. She heard Rusk behind her. He stood in the doorway and looked out at what was left of his ranch after the worst storm she'd seen in years, and she watched his face while he looked at it. He looked at the barrier. He looked at the pen. He looked at the southeast line. He looked for a long time at the drift to the north, the one that had built exactly where she'd said it would build. Then he said quietly, with no particular inflection, "You were right. About most of it," she said. "About the part that mattered," he said. She nodded. She nodded. She looked at the white world and the ranch that was still standing in it, and she didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. And some things you only damage by talking about them when the evidence is already there in front of you, solid and cold and irrefutable in the morning light. The day after the storm, the silence was its own kind of noise. Hester noticed it before she was fully awake, the absence of wind pressure against the walls, the stillness where the roaring had been, the particular quiet that only exists after something violent has finished. She lay in the loft for a few minutes, listening to it, before she climbed down. Rusk was already at the window when she reached the kitchen. He was standing with his coffee, looking out at the white expanse of the yard, and he had the expression of a man running a private inventory. His left shoulder was held slightly lower than the right, and he moved his arm carefully when he turned to acknowledge her. But he was up and dressed, and that told her what she needed to know about the injury. Everything's still standing? She said. Everything's still standing, he said. She looked past him out the window. The drift to the north had built exactly as she'd predicted, a clean, deep formation in the open ground beyond the barrier. Nowhere near the cattle pen, nowhere near the hay storage. The wind barrier itself was visible above the snow line, still at its angle, still in place. Not elegant. It leaned slightly in two places where the posts had taken the worst of the pressure, but it was there. I need to walk the line, she said. After breakfast, he said. She looked at him. He looked back with the patient expression of a man who had decided that some things were not negotiable. After breakfast, she agreed. They walked the full property line together, which was not something that had happened before. Always it had been her alone, or her with Tobin, or Rusk doing his own separate assessment. This time they went together, and neither of them commented on the fact. Hester noted the two places where the barrier posts needed resetting. Rusk noted a section of the north fence that had taken on more snow weight than the posts could carry cleanly and would need reinforcing before the next weather event. They talked about what they were looking at in the practical language of people who have shared work, short, specific, no wasted words. Cattle were stressed but intact, every animal accounted for. The 4 calves that had been brought inside were fine. The hay supply reduced by the 9 lost bales, stretched by Rusk's adjusted feeding schedule, was adequate. Not comfortable, but adequate. When they came back around to the southeast section, Rusk's stopped at the gap she'd cut in the fence, and the wire Tobin had strung across it in the dark. He looked at the drift pattern on the far side of the gap, the snow that had come through and deposited itself in the field beyond rather than piling against the buried line. He stood there for long enough that she stopped walking and waited. I would have reinforced the original line, he said finally. Tried to shore it up. I know. It would have failed. Probably. He looked at the drift. You made the decision alone. I wasn't there. You were hurt, she said. There wasn't time to wait. I know that. He looked at her. I'm not criticizing it. I'm saying you had to decide by yourself to break apart something that was ours in order to save it. That's not a small thing. She held his gaze. No, she said, wasn't. He looked back at the gap, at Tobin's wire strung between the posts in the pragmatic, slightly irregular pattern of someone working fast in bad conditions. The boy did good work, he said. He did. Rusk nodded once, like something had been confirmed rather than concluded, and they walked back to the house. Garrett Hollis came 3 days later. Came on horseback through the snow that was still crusted and deep in the open sections, and he came alone, which was different from his usual approach, which involved arriving in a way that suggested witnesses. He tied up at the post and came to the door and took his hat off when Hester opened it, which was also different. Mrs. Rowan, he said. Mr. Hollis. He looked past her into the kitchen, then back at her. I'd like to speak with Rusk, he said, and with you if you're willing. She let him in. Rusk came from the back room, saw who it was, and his expression had settled into something neutral but attentive. They sat at the table, all 3 of them, and Hester poured coffee because the situation called for it, and because having something to do with her hands gave her an excuse not to say anything before she understood what this was. Hollis held his cup and looked at the table for a moment. He was a man who was accustomed to speaking first in any room he entered, and the fact that he was taking time suggested he'd been thinking about this on the ride over. Lost 40 head, he said. Back section. The fence line on the northeast gave out overnight, and they drifted. He paused. Found them this morning, spread across 2 miles of open country. Some of them are gone for good, Rusk said. I'm sorry to hear it. Hollis looked at him. Then he looked at Hester. My northeast fence line is straight, he said. Standard build. Same as I've done for 11 years. Hester said nothing. Rusk's line held, Hollis said. Angled barrier. He stopped, started again. I could see it from the ridge when I was out looking for the cattle. The drift pattern was different. The snow went north. It didn't pile against his line. The kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of the house adjusting to the cold. Laughed at your fence. Hollis said to Hester. He said it plainly, without decoration, more than once. I told people it wouldn't work. I know, she said. I was wrong. She looked at him steadily. He wasn't a man who said those words easily. She could see the cost of them in the set of his jaw, the way he was looking at the table rather than her face. The principle isn't complicated, she said, and she kept her voice even. Nothing sharp in it. Wind wants to go somewhere. You give it a straight barrier. It piles everything against that barrier until the pile tops it. You give it an angled surface. It deflects. The snow follows the wind. How did you know that? I watched water long enough to understand how things move when they can't go through something. He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his face, not quite respect. Not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that had room for respect to grow if he let it. Would you be willing to look at my northeast configuration? He said. Tell me what you see. She looked at Rusk. He was watching her with the careful expression of a man who has learned to stay out of a thing that isn't his to manage. Can do that, she said, when the snow clears enough to see the lay of the land properly. Hollis nodded. He drank his coffee. He put his hat back on when he stood to leave, and at the door he turned back and said, The cattle you've got look good. Good condition for what went through last night. They're good animals, Rusk said. They are, Hollis said, and then he left. Rusk looked at Hester after the door closed. 11 years, he said. He's never asked anyone for help with his operation. He didn't ask for help, she said. He asked for a second set of eyes. There's a difference. Rusk almost smiled. Almost, is there? For men like him, she said. There absolutely is. Creed came a week later, and he did not come alone, and he did not come to acknowledge anything. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize, and Grover Finch, the property agent, who had delivered the news about Owen's debt 7 months earlier. Finch had the same careful politeness as before, the same sense of a man who had given bad news, often enough that he'd developed a professional distance from the content of what he was delivering. Hester saw them coming from the window and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She went to the door before they reached it. Creed looked at her, and then past her, and then back at her, and his expression had shed the bored amusement she'd seen in the fall. What was underneath it was harder to read. I need to speak with Rusk, he said. He's here, she said. She didn't move from the doorway. Privately, he said. Whatever you have to say to him is going to be said in front of me, she said, or it's going to wait until I'm somewhere else, which is not going to happen while you're on this property. Behind her, Rusk appeared and put his hand briefly on the doorframe, beside her, not pushing past, not displacing her, just present. What do you want, Creed? He said. Creed looked at both of them. 2 men behind him shifted slightly. Finch examined his boots. I've had reports about the storm damage in the area, Creed said. Significant losses. I've been offering assistance to neighbors who are in difficulty. He paused in the way of a man who has rehearsed a speech and is now delivering it slightly off his original rhythm. The offer I made you last spring still stands. Fair market. Full payment. My ranch isn't for sale, Rusk said. Your ranch lost feedstock. Your fence. My fence held, Rusk said. My cattle are fine. My feed is adequate. He looked at Creed with the level gaze of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. Is that all? Creed's eyes moved to Hester. She'd seen that particular look before the calculation of a man reassessing an obstacle he'd underestimated. You've built yourself a situation here, Mrs. Rowan, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't quite a threat. It occupied the territory between those 2 things, with the deliberate ambiguity of a man who liked to leave doors open. I've built a working arrangement, she said, which is what I came here to do. And the debt your husband left behind? There it was. She'd been waiting for it, is being addressed, she said, through my own labor and my own means, which is also what I came here to do. $1,400 is a significant amount for a woman in your position, too. $1,400, she said, is a number. Numbers get smaller if you work at them long enough. She looked at him steadily. Is there something specific you'd like to discuss, Mr. Creed? Or are you here to remind me of things I'm already aware of? The two men behind Creed exchanged a glance. Finch had moved to examining the middle distance. Creed looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on his head, which was a kind of punctuation. "Good day, Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Rusk." They rode out. Hester stood in the doorway and watched them go until they were at the edge of the property, and then she stepped back inside and closed the door. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the table where nobody could see them. Rusk said, "He'll be back. I know, he doesn't give up on land he wants. I know that too." She breathed out slowly. "He came to see if the storm had damaged us enough that you'd consider selling. It didn't, so now he knows he needs a different approach." "What approach?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But whatever it is, it'll be legal. He works legal. That's what makes him difficult." Rusk sat down at the table. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The debt," he said. "The 1,400. She looked at him. "I want to know where you are with it," he said. "Not because it's my business. Because if Creed decides to use it as leverage, and he already owns the debt," she said. "He bought it from whoever Owen borrowed from. He's held it this whole time." She sat down across from him. Could have pressed it harder at any point. He hasn't, which means he's using it as a long game. He thinks eventually I'll run out of capacity to manage it, and I'll have to take whatever he offers. Will you? She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "How much have you brought in?" He said it, straightforwardly, without apology for asking. "Since arriving here, the needlework I've sold, through the Milford dry goods, the preserves, the medicinal preparations I've been making from the kitchen garden, just over $60. She said it without embarrassment. $60 was $60. "I'm working on a larger contract, Mrs. Hollis mentioned she needs several winter garments made up. That's another $20-25, if the work is what I expect it to be." Rusk was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No, but it's not 1,400. "Not yet," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his cup. "What I'm saying," he said, without looking up, "is that it's a number that gets smaller if you work at it long enough." Your words. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "That's what I said." He nodded. He stood up and took his cup to the sink. "There's a load of timber I've been meaning to sell to the mill in Ferris Crossing," he said, his back to her. "Been sitting since September. If you want to take it in next week, you could handle the sale and keep 10% of whatever you get for it." She understood what that was. It wasn't charity. He genuinely had timber to sell and genuinely needed someone to handle the transport and negotiation. But the offer of the percentage was something else, a quiet piece of architecture he was placing between her situation and collapse. "That's fair," she said. "Good," he said. And that was the end of it. The Hollis garments became something larger than she'd anticipated. She went to walk his northeast fence line in the third week of December, when the snow had settled enough to read the land clearly, and she brought Tobin and spent 2 hours going over the configuration and explaining her reasoning to Hollis, who listened in the way of a man who has decided to take something seriously. She showed him the angles. She explained the drift behavior. She drew it in the snow with a stick and showed him what the wind would do against a straight barrier versus what it would do against a redirecting one. He asked good questions. She revised her opinion of him slightly, not all the way up to likable, but closer to useful, which was more important. His wife, Marta, had been in the house when they returned, and she'd offered coffee, and in the 20 minutes of kitchen conversation that followed, Marta had looked at the mending basket on the table and mentioned, almost without meaning to, that she had a pile of winter work that had been waiting 3 months for someone with the skill to handle it. Hester quoted her a price. Marta accepted it. Word moved the way it always moves in frontier communities, along the paths of women talking to women, at the trading post and the water pump and the quiet exchanges in doorways. By the end of January, Hester had work from 4 different households: needlework, garment making, some basics medicinal preparation from the herbs she'd been growing in the kitchen window. and one larger commission from a rancher's wife, 2 properties over, who wanted a quilt assembled from a collection of family fabrics she'd been accumulating for years, but never had the time to put together. The money came in slowly. That was the nature of the work. But it came in. She kept a record of every cent in the same notebook she'd used for wind observations, now repurposed for accounting. The 2 different kinds of recording sat in the same book, which somehow seemed right: the weather and the money. Both things you tracked carefully, because ignoring them cost you. By the end of February, the debt was at $1,140. Still enormous. Still the kind of number that made her chest tight when she thought about it directly. But $300 smaller than it had been, and the trajectory was clear if she could sustain it. Creed knew. She didn't know how he knew, but he knew. Men like Creed always knew the state of things that affected their interests. It was the investment they made in information, and she could feel it in the increased frequency of small irritations. A delivery of thread she'd ordered through the Milford store arrived damaged, and the storekeeper said the shipment had gotten wet in transit, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers when he said it. A woman who'd commissioned 2 shirts from her sent a note canceling without explanation 3 days before the work was due. These things could all have been coincidence. They could also have been Creed, applying pressure in the way men with influence applied pressure indirectly, deniably, in ways that were difficult to prove and exhausting to fight. She replaced the thread from a contact in Ferris Crossing. She finished the shirts anyway and offered them at a reduced rate to Marta Hollis, who bought them the same day. Kept working. Rusk watched her manage it without commenting, which was the form of support she needed from him at that stage. He was not a man who had easy words for difficult situations, but he was present, and presence was its own kind of statement. One evening in early March, he came in from the barn and set a folded piece of paper on the table in front of her without explanation. She opened it. It was a letter from the Ferris Crossing Mill, confirming the timber sale she'd handled in January, the full account of it, which she'd seen. But there was a handwritten note at the bottom in different ink, dated 2 days ago, indicating that Rusk had negotiated a standing arrangement for any additional timber from the property at a rate 15% above the standard. She looked at him. "Read the number at the bottom," he said. She read it. The standing arrangement would generate, over the course of the spring logging season, somewhere between $200 and $300 above what she'd been expecting. "That's your 10% on the full arrangement," he said. "Not just the January sale." She put the paper down. "It's not what we agreed." "I renegotiated," he said simply. "The mill wants the access. I had leverage I didn't know I had in January. The rate reflects what the timber is actually worth." He sat down. 10% of what it's worth is more than 10% of what I thought it was worth. That's not charity. That's arithmetic. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the particular steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it and would like to move on. "Thank you," she said. "You handled the negotiation in January," he said. "They liked dealing with you better than dealing with me. Said you knew the product better than expected." He looked slightly puzzled by this, as if the concept of someone knowing timber well who hadn't grown up in logging was mildly surprising. "How do you know timber?" "My father's mill was a sawmill," she said. "Not just water." He said, and that appeared to settle the matter for him. April came with mud and the particular quality of light that arrives when winter releases its grip on a land that has been holding its breath for months. The cattle were in better condition than Hester had dared to hope. In December, the feed having stretched adequately through the careful management of the adjusted schedule. 3 of the 4 calves from the storm period had grown into healthy young animals. The 4th had not made it through February, a loss that Cora had taken with a solemnity that worried Hester for several days, until Cora announced that she had decided the calf's death was not to be dwelt on because the other 3 were fine, and it was inefficient to be sad about one thing when 3 other things were good. Hester had not known whether to laugh or be concerned about her daughter's practical soul. she'd settled on quietly grateful. Bramwell Creed made his move in April. It was legal as she'd predicted. He went to the county office and filed a petition citing the outstanding debt, arguing that since the debt was secured against Hester's former property he now owned, and since the debt had been subsequently assigned to him as a creditor, he had standing to press for satisfaction through any assets she had accumulated since the original default, which, in plain language, meant he was trying to attach her earnings. The county clerk sent a notice. Hester read it twice, then put it in her coat pocket and finished the morning's work before she let herself think about it. When she'd finished, she sat down at the table and read it a third time and thought about it carefully. She was not a lawyer, but she'd read more legal language in the past 8 months than most women were expected to encounter in a lifetime, and she understood the structure of what Creed was attempting. He was arguing that her labor, her needlework earnings, her commissions, her percentage of the timber arrangement constituted income that could be attached against the outstanding debt. Problem for Creed was that the debt was secured against the house and property, which he already owned. His claim that he could reach beyond that security to her personal earnings was creative legal reasoning rather than settled law, and she knew it because she'd spent 3 evenings in December reading through the county legal digest that Rusk kept in the shelf above the desk. She needed to find someone who could confirm that reading. She found him in Ferris Crossing, a man named Aldous Webb, who was not quite a lawyer. He'd read law, but never passed the bar examination, but who had a reputation for understanding frontier property disputes well enough that people consulted him. She paid him $3 for an afternoon of his time, which was money she could not entirely afford. And she laid out the situation from the beginning. He read Creed's petition. He read the original debt agreement. He asked 4 questions, all of them specific, and she answered them accurately, including the ones that were not favorable to her position. He hasn't got it, Webb said finally. The security on this debt is the property. Took the property. That's the satisfaction of a secured debt. You get the security. The idea that he can also reach your subsequent personal earnings is not supported by the agreement he himself drew up. He tapped the debt document. Creed is a clever man, but he got greedy when he wrote this. He took your home thinking it was worth enough to satisfy the debt. If he'd structured it as an unsecured personal debt, he'd have more room to move. He didn't. He's going to argue that the original debt exceeds the value of the property. He might. And he might be right about the numbers. But that's a valuation argument, not an attachment argument. Can't reach your labor on these terms. Webb looked at her. You need to file a response. I can help you draft it. How much? $5 for the draft. You file it yourself. Paid him $5. She filed the response herself on a Tuesday morning at the county office, and the clerk processed it with an expression of mild surprise that she didn't acknowledge. Creed dropped the petition 4 days later. She heard about it from Rusk, who heard about it from the clerk, who apparently considered it noteworthy enough to mention to the first person from the Rusk property who came in. Rusk told her at dinner. He said it with the neutrality of a man reporting a weather event, but his eyes, when he said it, were not neutral. His eyes said something she was getting better at reading a satisfaction. He didn't express in words, because words weren't his primary language for satisfaction, but that was fully present nonetheless. He'll try something else, she said. Probably, Rusk said. Not this. Not this, he agreed. Cora said, What's an attachment petition? Something that didn't work, Hester said. Cora considered this and returned to her supper. Tobin looked at Hester with a look that said he'd understood more of what had been discussed than she'd accounted for. And she met his eyes and nodded slightly. Yes, that's what happened. Yes, we're okay, and he nodded back and ate. Hollis came in May with 2 of his neighbors, not to talk about fences this time. He came to talk about the configuration of his hay storage, which had performed badly through the winter, and which he now suspected was related to the drainage problem Hester had identified and fixed on Rusk's property months earlier. He brought the neighbors because they had the same question, and he'd apparently told them she was the person to ask. She answered their questions at the Rusk kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hand and a piece of charcoal for drawing on the back of an envelope, and she explained the drainage principle and the ventilation principle and the relationship between moisture and feed spoilage in winter storage. They listened. They asked questions. She answered the questions and asked some of her own about their specific configurations, their land angles, prevailing wind direction, because she'd learned that general principles needed local adjustment, and she wasn't going to tell them what to do without knowing what they were dealing with. Rusk sat in the corner for most of it and did not say much. He watched the men at his table listen to his housekeeper explain the physics of water movement and winter ventilation, and at one point he refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, which was the most domestic thing she'd seen him do. When the men left, he stood at the window and watched them ride out. "You know," he said, "when you arrived here, half these men were waiting for me to fail, so Creed could buy this place." "I know," she said. "Now they're coming here for advice. The storm helped." "You helped," he said. He turned from the window. Storm was just the occasion. She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, and he was standing in it in his usual way, not quite at ease, not quite uncomfortable, just present. And she thought about how different her picture of him was now versus the man she'd seen coming around the side of the barn that first afternoon. Not so different in the facts of him, just more complete. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "The north section," he said. "Pasture past the barrier. It's been fallow for 2 years. I haven't had the labor to work it. But if we put it to use properly, with the drainage correction extended." He stopped, started again. "I'm not going to be able to do it alone. Even with Tobin's help, it's too much land." "Are you asking me something?" she said. He looked at the table, back at her. He was a man who found the moment before a direct question deeply uncomfortable, and she'd seen him go around and around a thing before arriving at it, and she waited because that was what the moment needed. "I'm saying," he said, "that the arrangement we have what you do here, for this place, it's more than what we agreed to in November. Considerably more. I know, and I'd like to—" He stopped. "What I'm suggesting is that the arrangement ought to reflect that in writing, with a proper accounting of what you contribute and what that's worth." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of arrangement?" "A partnership," he said, "of the property. Formal, registered with the county." He was looking at the table again. "Your name on the land. Not as a worker, as a partner." Kitchen was very quiet. Outside she could hear Cora talking to the calves in the pen. The one-sided conversation of a child who has decided animals are reasonable conversational partners. "That's a significant thing to offer," she said. "It's a significant thing you've done," he said. "I still owe $1,100. The property partnership would be structured to account for that. The timber income goes toward it. The operation profits go toward it. Gets paid down through the work, same as it's been, but with a formal structure behind it." He looked up at her. "I've talked to Webb about the legal framework. It's possible. He can draw it up." She looked at him steadily. She was thinking about the morning in her kitchen, when Creed's men had been moving her chairs and her dishes, the morning when she'd stood in the middle of what used to be her life, and understood that she had nothing except her children and her mind and whatever she could build with those two things. She was thinking about the 9 compromised bales and the admission she'd made at the storage door, the gap she'd cut in the fence in the blizzard, response she'd filed at the county office, the $60, and then the $140, and then the $300, and then the approach of a number she'd once thought was impossible. She was thinking about Tobin fixing the gate hinges in the dark, and Cora cleaning the cut on Ruska's arm, with her tongue slightly between her teeth. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. "Not because I'm uncertain," she said. "Because a decision like this deserves more than a kitchen conversation." He nodded. "Take whatever time you need." She stood and went to refill her coffee, and she stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment longer than necessary. because she needed a second where he couldn't see her face, and she could let what she was feeling simply be what it was, not triumph, not relief, something more complicated than either of those, something that had weight and texture to it, particular feeling of a future that has stopped being a concept and started being a place you can actually stand. Turned around. "I'll have an answer by the end of the week," she said. "End of the week," he agreed. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. Outside, the spring light moved across the yard in the unhurried way of a season that has no interest in anyone's schedule, and the calves in the pen pressed their noses against the boards, and the wind barrier leaned slightly in two places, where it always leaned now, imperfect and solid against the sky. She took 4 days, not 7, not because she'd rushed the thinking, she hadn't. She'd given it the full weight it deserved, turning it over in the quiet hours before the household woke, walking the north pasture alone on the second afternoon, while Tobin worked the fence line and Cora was occupied with the calves. She'd walked the ground that would be named in the document, if she agreed. She'd stood in the middle of it and looked back at the house and the barn and the angled barrier and tried to see the whole of it, clearly not what she wanted it to be, not what she was afraid it might come, but what it actually was. What it actually was this, a working property that had survived a catastrophic winter in better condition than most of its neighbors, because of decisions she had made. A house where her children had stopped being afraid. A man who had offered her not rescue but recognition, which was a rarer thing than rescue and worth considerably more. She came in on the 4th evening while Rusk was still at the table with the day's accounts spread in front of him, and she sat down across from him and said, "Yes." He looked up from the papers. "Yes," she said again, "to the partnership. Send for Webb and have him draw it up." Rusk looked at her for a moment. He had the expression he sometimes got when something he'd been bracing for turned out to weigh less than expected. Not relief exactly, more like the adjustment a man makes when he's been holding tension in a muscle and can finally release it. "All right," he said. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would. The debt gets paid down through the operation income before any other distributions. Not partially fully. Until it's cleared, everything above basic household expenses goes toward it. I don't want a partnership built on a foundation that Creed still owns a piece of." He nodded. "Agreed. The North Pasture development comes out of the partnership budget, not out of my personal earnings from the needlework and the commissions. Those stay separate until the debt is clear. After that, we negotiate again." Also agreed. "And Tobin's labor gets accounted for properly. Not as a child helping out as a contributing worker. When he's old enough to take wages, he gets wages. Real ones." Rusk looked at her steadily. "He's 11, he said. "He won't always be," she said. A pause. "Agreed," he said. Put her hand flat on the table. "Then we have a deal." He looked at her hand on the table and then put his own hand beside it, not on it. Just beside it, the way of a man who understood the gesture without overcomplicating it. "We have a deal," he said. Webb came out the following week and spent a full afternoon at the kitchen table with papers and questions, and when he left he had everything he needed to draft the formal agreement. He was back in 10 days with the document, and both Hester and Rusk read it in full separately, at the table, in silence, which was the right way to read a document that was going to change both their lives. Hester found 2 provisions she wanted adjusted. Webb made the adjustments. Rusk found one. Webb made that one too. On the 3rd reading, everyone was satisfied, and they signed it, and Webb witnessed it. And the following Tuesday, Hester took it to the county office herself and registered it. Clerk looked at the document, looked at her, looked at the document again. "Rowan Rusk Partnership," he said, reading the formal designation. "Joint property interest." "That's correct," she said. Stamped it, he filed it. He handed her the registered copy with the expression of a man who had processed many documents in his years at this desk and was not prepared to have feelings about any of them. She put the copy in her coat pocket and walked out into the May afternoon and stood on the boardwalk for a moment before going to the wagon. The street of Ferris Crossing moved around her in its ordinary way, horses at the posts, women at the store fronts. A group of men outside the trading post, having a conversation that had nothing to do with her. She'd arrived in this territory with nothing but a bundle and 2 children, and a letter she wasn't sure had been received. She now had her name on land. Not borrowed land, not temporary land. Land with her name on it in the county register, visible to anyone who cared to look. She got in the wagon and drove home. The summer was the hardest work she'd done yet, which was saying something. The North Pasture development was not a small project. The drainage extension alone took most of June, her and Tobin and Rusk working in rotation. The 3 of them developing a rhythm that didn't need much verbal coordination anymore. Rusk would start a thing. Tobin would pick up the thread. Hester would come behind and make the adjustments that the original approach hadn't accounted for. And then Rusk would look at her adjustments and either nod or point out where they created a downstream complication. And they'd work it out standing in the dirt without raising their voices. Cora, who had turned 8 in the spring with the solemnity of someone who feels the significance of milestones, had appointed herself the official keeper of the 3 calves, and had negotiated this role into an acknowledged responsibility rather than a childhood amusement. Kept records her own records. In a small book she'd asked Hester for of each animal's weight and behavior and feed consumption, in handwriting that was improving fast because she practiced it like a job. Rusk had found the record book on the table one evening and looked through it without comment. But the following week he'd brought her a proper accounting ledger from Ferris Crossing, kind with the columns printed in, and handed it to her without explanation. Cora had received it with a gravity that suggested she understood exactly what it meant, and had transferred all her records into it the same day. Hester had watched this transaction from across the room and thought about the kinds of respect across Kayak that don't announce themselves. Debt, meanwhile, was contracting. By midsummer, it was at $840. The timber arrangement was performing above what Webb had estimated, partly because Hester had renegotiated the rate a second time in June, armed with better information about comparable arrangements in the county, and a clear sense of what the mill needed from this particular property that they couldn't easily get elsewhere. The mill manager, a man named Percival Stroud, who had the distracted air of someone perpetually calculating board feet, had agreed to the new rate after a 40-minute conversation that Hester had conducted across his desk, with the same directness she'd brought to every negotiation since October. Stroud had said, afterward, to someone who mentioned it to Rusk later, "That woman knows timber better than half my buyers." Rusk had told Hester this over dinner, and she'd said, "Your father's mill?" And she'd said, "My father's mill," and that had been the end of it. But she'd been quietly pleased for the rest of the evening. The commission work continued through the summer. Marta Hollis had become something like an informal coordinator, connecting Hester with women across 3 properties who needed skilled needlework or garment making, and the arrangement had grown into a small but consistent stream of income. Hester was not sentimental about it. It was work, and it paid. And the payment went into the accounting column. She kept the same notebook as the wind records and the operational notes. All of it together in one place, because that was how she thought about it. All one continuous project. She was repaying Owen's debt with work he hadn't valued, and knowledge he hadn't noticed, and patience he hadn't had. There was something in that she allowed herself to feel, on quiet evenings when the numbers were good, before she closed the book and went to bed. Creed made his last move in August. She had expected something. The legal petition had failed, and he'd gone quiet in the way of a man who was repositioning rather than retreating, and she'd been watching for the shape of the next attempt. What she hadn't expected was that it would come through Owen. A letter arrived at the county office addressed to Hester Rowan, forwarded from the Ferris Crossing postmaster, and the return address was a town in Colorado she'd never heard of. She opened it at the kitchen table with Rusk across from her, because she'd gotten past the point of managing difficult things privately when there was someone present who had a stake in the outcome. Owen's handwriting. She recognized it before she recognized her own name at the top of the letter. She read it. Then she read it again. Owen was alive. He was in Colorado. He had been, from what she could piece together from the careful language of the letter, working in a mining operation for the past year and a half. He wrote that he'd heard she was in some difficulty and wanted her to know that he harbored no ill will. He wrote that he understood the situation, with the debt had been hard on her and the children. He wrote that he was enclosing $20, which was what he could spare. $20. She put the letter on the table. Rusk had been reading her face. He didn't ask what it said, he waited. "He's alive," she said. "Colorado." Rusk was quiet. "He sent $20, she said. She heard the words as she said them, and something in her settled not with anger, though anger was there underneath it, but with a clarity that had been building for months and was now complete. She had spent $1,400 of debt and 8 months of work and 2 children's worth of disrupted childhood on the consequences of a man who was alive and healthy and enclosing $20. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. "Does he know about the debt amount?" Rusk said. "He knew when he left," she said. "He knew the amount. He knew who held it. Then he knew what he was leaving behind." "Yes." Rusk looked at his hands on the table. He had large hands, scarred from years of work, and he looked at them the way he looked at most things, with patience, without hurry. "What do you want to do?" he said. She thought about it honestly. Not what she was supposed to want, not what would look right, but what she actually wanted. "I want to write back," she said. "Once. And then I want to stop thinking about him." "Then do that." She wrote the letter that evening. It took her 20 minutes, which was shorter than she'd expected. She told Owen that the children were well. She told him that she had established herself and that the debt was being addressed. Told him that she did not require the $20 and was returning it. She told him that she wished him no harm and expected nothing further from him. She did not tell him about the partnership or the land, or the barrier that had held through the worst storm in a decade, or his son setting fence wire in the dark, or his daughter keeping livestock records in a proper accounting ledger. Those things were not his. He hadn't been there for any of them, and he had no claim on any of them, and she was not going to offer him even the second-hand warmth of knowing they existed. She sealed the letter and put it with the $20 and mailed it the next morning. And when she walked away from the postmaster's window, she did not look back. That was the last she thought of Owen Rowan for a very long time. The debt cleared in October. Not dramatically, not in one large payment or a single decisive moment. Cleared the way, real things, clear, incrementally the number shrinking through September, and then through the first weeks of October until one evening, Hester sat at the table with the account book and added the last column and arrived at 0. She sat there looking at the 0 for a while. Cold evening. The first real bite of the second winter settling into the house, and the lamp was burning, and somewhere in the back room, Tobin was doing something with a length of wire that produced occasional soft metallic sounds, and Cora had fallen asleep on the bench against the wall with her head on her arm, and her accounting ledger still open on the table in front of her. Rusk came in from the barn and hung up his coat and looked at her sitting at the table immensity and read something in her posture that stopped him. "What?" he said. She turned the account book and slid it across the table to him. He came to look at it. He looked at the final column. He looked at the 0. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, which was typical, and then he sat down across from her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He looked at the book and then at her. "How does it feel?" She thought about it. People expected certain answers to that question: relief, joy, the emotional fanfare that the moment seemed to call for. What she actually felt was quieter and more specific than any of those words. She felt the weight of the last year in her body, in her hands and her back, and the particular tiredness behind her eyes that she'd been carrying since November of the previous year. She felt the absence of the things she'd been working toward, the way you notice a sound only when it stops. Like I can breathe in a different direction, she said. Rusk looked at her for a moment, and he almost smiled, the closest he came to it. The almost smile she'd been cataloging since November, the one that appeared when something had landed exactly right. A good way to put it, he said. Cora stirred on the bench. She opened one eye and looked at the two of them, and then at the account book, and then closed her eye again. She was either asleep or pretending to be, and Hester suspected the latter. From the back room, Tobin's wire sound stopped. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway with a completed piece of work in his hands, a hinge assembly he'd been building from scratch, his own design, an improvement on the standard issue that accounted for a weakness he'd identified in the way heavy gates wore on the mounting point. He held it out to Rusk. "Tell me what's wrong with it," he said. "Not what do you think what's wrong." He'd learned to ask the more useful question. Rusk took it. He turned it over. He tested the pivot, checked the tolerance, pressed the points where stress would accumulate, took his time with it. "Nothing's wrong with it," he said. Tobin looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been expecting a longer conversation. "Thing? The tolerancing on the pivot is slightly loose. You'll want to tighten that before you use it in the field. But the design is sound." Rusk set it on the table. "Where did you come up with the mounting offset?" Tobin explained it. He used words Hester recognized as her own, the way she talked about systems, the vocabulary of how things bear weight, and what happens when they don't filter through his own thinking and reshape it into something that was his. Rusk listened and asked one question. Tobin answered it, and his answer led to a discussion of the North Gate configuration that lasted 20 minutes, and ended with Rusk saying he'd like to try the design on the two gates that had given the most trouble over the past year. Tobin nodded, like this was simply the expected outcome, but his ears went slightly red, which was the tell. Hester looked at her son at his hands and his careful face, and the way he stood in the kitchen of this house with the ease of someone who belonged in it, and she thought about the boy she'd woken before sunrise. In October of the previous year, the one who had put on his coat and picked up his bundle and asked which direction they were walking. Same boy. Different ground under his feet, different understanding of what he was capable of building. That was, she thought, probably the most important thing. Not the debt or the land or the legal document with her name in the county register. Not the wind barrier or the corrected drainage or the petition that Creed had dropped. The most important thing was that her children had watched her work when she could have stopped, rebuild when she'd made mistakes, refuse when she could have given in, and choose when every option was bad. They'd watched all of it. They were carrying all of it. Whatever happened next, they were carrying it. Creed sold his property interests in the county the following spring. She heard about it from Webb, who had kept a loose professional eye on anything involving Creed's activities since the petition. The sale was quiet, no announcement, no drama, just a transfer of holdings to a land company based in another territory. Presumably, Creed had decided that this particular collection of properties was not going to generate the returns he'd been planning for, and his capital was better deployed elsewhere. The Rusk property, the Rowan Rusk property, was not for sale, and therefore not part of the transfer. Sat on the land it had always sat on, and did what it had always done, which was grow things and shelter animals, and require more work than one person could do alone. Hester heard about the sale and felt nothing in particular, which was the best possible response. The man had occupied a significant portion of her thinking for over a year, and the end of his local presence arrived without ceremony and departed the same way. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were resolved and moved on. She had plenty to move on to. The second winter was harder in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because they expanded the operation more cattle, more pasture in use, the north section fully developed and productive. By the time the cold came, which meant more work at the critical moments, more decisions to make faster with more consequences attached. Easier because the systems were built, the barrier stood, the drainage held, the ventilation was right. The hay went in dry and came out. Dry every bale accounted for in Cora's ledger with the precision of someone who had decided that imprecision was a form of disrespect to the animals that depended on the accuracy. There was a storm in January that was smaller than the previous years, but meaner in a particular way, hitting from a slightly different angle than expected. Hester noticed the angle shift before it hit and made 2 adjustments to the barrier configuration, temporary ones. Ropes and additional panels she'd prepositioned since November because she'd been thinking about the vulnerability on the east face, and the storm passed through, and the drift went where she'd intended, and the cattle were fine, and Rusk came in afterward and looked at the temporary additions and said, "When did you put those up?" "Yesterday afternoon," she said. He looked at her. "How did you know the angle was going to be different?" "Cloud formation at dawn was lower on the south end than the north," she said. It suggested the rotation was coming from slightly further east than the prevailing direction. He stood there for a moment. "My father ranched this land for 30 years, he said. He never read the clouds like that. "My father ran a mill for 30 years, she said. He never thought about what would happen if the water wheel stopped moving. You pay attention to the thing that can hurt you most." He was quiet for a moment. "What hurts you most?" he said. The question surprised her. It was more direct than his usual register. She looked at him and understood that he wasn't asking about weather, thought about it. Honestly, the way she'd taught herself to think about things, she didn't want to look at directly. "Wasting what I've built," she said finally. "That's the honest answer. Not losing it to something I couldn't control. Wasting it through carelessness or fear." She looked at him. He looked at the window, at the white world outside it, the drift going exactly where it was supposed to go. "Same," he said, "more or less." They looked at each other. Across the kitchen, these 2 people who had arrived at the same address from completely different directions and had been building something together for over a year now, and the thing they were building had a name on a legal document and a physical shape in the land, and also another shape, a less registered one, that existed in the way they talked to each other, and the way they didn't talk, in the coffee poured before it was asked for, and the decisions made alone in the dark when the other one was hurt and couldn't help. She thought about what to say and decided that nothing she could say was going to be more accurate than what was already visible. So she said nothing. She went back to the stove. He went back to the desk. The house held the cold outside where it belonged, and inside there was warmth that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with what they'd decided to build and keep building, even when the materials were inadequate and the weather was wrong. The sewing machine arrived in March. She hadn't expected it. She'd accepted. Months ago, that the items Creed's men had taken from the house were gone, permanently sold, dispersed, absorbed into the general movement of property in a territory that had no sentiment for the belongings of women who couldn't pay their debts. The sewing machine had been her mother's, then hers, the one piece of equipment that had made the needlework income possible in the first place, and she'd been working without it on loan equipment from Marta Hollis that was adequate but not the same. The wagon that brought it was driven by Grover Finch, of all people, and she recognized him coming up the road and felt the old cold before she remembered that Creed was gone from this territory, and Finch's business here was therefore something different. Pulled up and climbed down and took his hat off and said, "Mrs. Rowan, I've got property here that belongs to you." She looked at the wagon. There was the sewing machine, wrapped in canvas, and beside it a wooden crate she recognized as the one that had held her kitchen things, and beside that a rolled rug she'd made herself from strips of her children's outgrown clothing over the 3 years before Owen left. How, she said. Finch had the air of a man completing an obligation he'd been given specific instructions about. Mr. Creed instructed that certain items be returned before his holdings in the county were transferred, he said. I'm told the personal effects were cataloged separately from the property itself, and he wished them returned to their original owner. She stood in the yard and looked at the wagon for a long moment. Creed had returned her things. She would spend time later trying to understand why, whether it was a gesture of something like conscience, or a legal precaution, or simply the action of a man who was leaving a territory and wanted his accounts clean in whatever way made sense to him. She wouldn't arrive at a satisfying answer. Some things people do don't have satisfying explanations, and she'd learned that spending effort on those explanations was one of the more reliable ways to waste a life. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said. "I'll get my son to help unload." She went and found Tobin, and together they brought the things in, and Hester set the sewing machine in the corner of the main room, where the light from the east window hit it in the morning, which was when she did her best detailed work. She unwrapped it and checked the mechanism, and found it in the same condition she'd last seen it, and she sat down at it and ran her hands over it the way you run your hands over. Something familiar that you'd prepared yourself to never touch again. She sat there for a minute, just a minute. Then she got up and went to start dinner. Tobin, from across the room, said quietly, "I'm glad it came back." "Me, too," she said. From the crate, Cora had retrieved the rug and was unrolling it in the middle of the floor, examining it with the eye of someone conducting an assessment. "This needs mending on the south corner," she said. "About 4 inches. "I can see that," Hester said. "I can do it if you show me the stitch," Cora said. She looked at her daughter, 8 years old, efficient and direct, and not particularly given to displays of feeling, but present in the way of a person who had decided that paying attention was a form of love. "Come here after supper," she said. "I'll show you." Rusk appeared in the doorway from outside, stamping mud off his boots, and took in the scene, the machine in the corner, the rug on the floor. Cora crouched over the worn corner, Tobin against the wall with his arms crossed and a look of quiet satisfaction. "Finch was here," Rusk said. "He was," she said. He looked at the sewing machine. He looked at her. He said, "Good. Just that. Just good." But the words sat in the room differently than it would have if he'd said more, the way a single well-placed post holds more than a whole line of poorly set ones. There's something people say about survival that it's the point, that making it through is the measure of whether you've done something right. Hester had thought about this across the year she'd spent at the Rusk property, particularly in the months after the storm when it was clearest that they'd survived something that had broken other operations. She'd sat with that idea and turned it over, and what she'd concluded not quickly, not easily, because she didn't do anything quickly when she thought it mattered, was that survival was not the point. Survival was the minimum. It was the floor, not the ceiling. What she'd built here was not just a survival. It was a structure, a system of relationships between the land and the weather, and the people working the land, and the decisions made in the dark when nobody could help. It was a partnership registered in a county document, and also registered in the daily evidence of 2 people who had learned each other's thinking well enough to anticipate it. It was a child who asked what was wrong with his work because he'd learned that useful feedback was worth more than approval. It was a daughter who kept livestock records in a proper ledger and offered to learn a new stitch because she understood that skill was something you built and maintained and passed forward. None of it was perfect. The barrier still leaned in 2 places and always would. Hester still caught herself sometimes making decisions alone that should have been shared ones. The old habit of self-sufficiency that was sometimes a strength and sometimes a wall. Rusk still went silent at exactly the moments when words would have been useful, and she'd learned to read the silence, but that didn't mean she always liked it. Tobin still had nightmares sometimes. The kind she knew were about a man on a horse who said he was riding to Milford for feed, and she couldn't fix that with systems or preparation or careful observation of cloud formations. The imperfections were not failures. They were the texture of actual things, actual people, an actual life being built in actual weather on actual land that had no interest in anyone's plan for it. What you did with that was the question. Whether you built something that could adapt to what the land was actually doing, instead of what you wished it was doing. Whether you were honest about your mistakes before someone else paid for them. Whether you rebuilt when you got it wrong, whether you stayed. Hester had stayed, and the thing she'd built by staying was bigger than anything she'd had before, measured not in dollars or acres or the square footage of a house she'd once owned and lost. Bigger in the way that things are bigger when they've been earned by the specific currency of hard work and honest failure.
Yeah.
And the decision, made again every morning in a cold kitchen, to try. On a morning in late spring, almost exactly a year after, Hester had walked into the county office and filed the partnership document. She stood at the edge of the north pasture and looked at what the previous 18 months had made. Pasture was green and productive, the drainage extension running clean along the eastern edge, exactly as she'd drawn it on a piece of paper in the lamplight of a winter she'd thought might be her last bad one. Cattle were in good weight. Calves a new batch, Cora already recording them, with the focus of a professional moved in the morning light with the energy of animals that had been well kept through a hard winter and were now enjoying the reprieve. Rusk came to stand beside her. He'd been up the ridge checking a fence section, and his boots were wet, and he was squinting slightly against the light, in the way he always squinted when he was looking at something he was trying to assess accurately. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the drainage channel that was doing its quiet, unglamorous work of keeping the water where it belonged. Father would have liked this, he said. Not her husband, her father. He'd learned the distinction. He would have had notes, she said. Good notes or critical ones? Both, she said. He always had both. Rusk smiled, actually smiled. Not the almost smile, but the real version, which she'd seen perhaps a dozen times in 18 months, and which still had the qualities of something unexpected, like a door opening in a wall you'd assumed was solid. I want to show you something, he said. He led her to the barn and through it to the small office space at the back where he kept his accounts and the operational documents, and on the desk was a piece of paper he'd clearly spent some time on. He picked it up. It was a hand-drawn diagram of the full property, the pastures, structures, the barrier, the drainage, the fence lines with annotations in his careful, blocky handwriting, indicating the improvements made over the past year and a half. In the corner, in slightly smaller writing, was a list of what the operation had produced since November: cattle, numbers, feed efficiency, income from the timber arrangement, projected figures for the coming season. At the bottom, in the same careful hand, was a single line. Rowan Rusk, year 2. She looked at it for a long time. Year 2. The first year had been survival, systems building, debt reduction, the long grinding work of proving something to people who had already decided it was impossible. Year 2 was something different. Year 2 was what you did when the foundation was in, and you could start putting up walls. I've been thinking about the east section, he said. He was standing beside her, looking at the diagram. The terrain east of the main pasture. It's been running cattle, but not efficiently. I think there's a configuration that would work better, but I haven't been able to figure the drainage. He looked at her sideways. I thought you might have ideas. She looked at the east section on the diagram. She thought about what she knew of the terrain there, the way the land fell, the way the water moved in a wet spring, the angle of the slope against the prevailing wind. She thought about what she'd told him on one of the first mornings, that she was here because she needed a place to stand while she figured out what came next. She had the place. She had figured it out. What came next was this: more work, more thinking, more mornings and winters, and decisions made with imperfect information and her best available judgment, in partnership with a man who'd learned to trust her judgment, and an operation that had learned to trust the systems she'd built. I have some ideas, she said. I thought you might, he said. She pulled out the notebook, the same notebook, now on its second binding, wind records and account figures and observations, and the letter she'd written to Owen that she'd kept a copy of because she'd wanted to remember the exact tone of it, and she turned to a clean page and started to draw. Outside, Tobin's voice carried across the yard as he called to Cora about something. The two of them, working in the morning, in the way they'd learned to work, competently and without drama, the children of a woman who'd shown them that hard things were survivable, and that survivable was just the beginning. The wind moved across the pasture from the northwest, found the angled barrier, and deflected exactly as it was supposed to. The drift built in the open ground to the north. The cattle moved in the green morning. The drainage ran clean. The fence still leaned in 2 places. It always would. It had survived because it adapted, because it was built by people who refused to stop building, even when what they'd built wasn't perfect, even when the storm was worse than expected, even when the only way to save the thing was to break a piece of it open and let the wind through. That was the whole of it, really. Not the barrier or the drainage or the partnership document or the debt that had been paid to zero. The whole of it was the decision, made in the dark on a cold October night in a draw with 2 sleeping children and a dying fire, to get up in the morning and keep going. Everything else, the land, the life, the name on the register, the man beside her drawing diagrams at a desk, everything else was what keeping going looked like when you did it long enough. Hester Roseman put her pencil to the page and drew the first line of the East Section plan, and the morning held steady around her, and the work went on.